I'm an entertainment designer who's also a lifelong car addict, science nerd, sci-fi geek, and general anything mechanical enthusiast. I thought I would turn my imagination into a YouTube channel and share it with the world. Come along and explore all kinds of crazy from my notebooks, sketchbooks, and even my mind. Welcome to Design Imaginarium. Welcome back to Design Imaginarium. Today, we're going to do a speculative aviation video. But first, it's easy to look back now with hindsight and say that the Germans and their Axis allies never had a chance of winning in World War II. But that's hindsight. It's easy to forget today that at the height of their power when they had occupied most of Europe, the Nazis controlled 1/5 of the world's population and almost 1/3 of humanity's wealth and productive capacity. And their buddies, the Japanese, controlled another 20% of the world's population and possibly as much as 15% of the world's wealth and productive capacity. So together, the Axis powers controlled 40% of the Earth's population and almost half of humanity's productive resources. In 1939, the year that Germany's territorial aspirations turned into outright military invasion, they were producing 4 times as many aircraft as the Americans were. This video is going to focus on the military power dynamic in what's referred to as the European theater of war. That is, the war between the Allies and Germany. Now, there are lots of reasons that the Allies won the war in the European theater and the Axis didn't, but one of the primary reasons was that as long as England held out against German invasion, the Allies could bomb Germany's armaments factories and disrupt Germany's war production. Conversely, the Germans could and did bomb the English armaments factories, but the Germans couldn't bomb and disrupt American war production because none of their aircraft had the range. This was a big problem for Germany because although America was on the tail end of a crippling economic depression in 1940, and at the time had laughably inadequate war production capability, the country was the single biggest economy in the world and had incredible potential to ramp up war production. Once American war production did come online, German high command obsessed about how they could build an intercontinental bomber to fly across the Atlantic, drop some bombs on the war factories on the American eastern seaboard, and then fly home, all on 1 tank of gas. The Germans even had a name for this program. It was called the Amerikabomber. This program resulted in designs from Messerschmitt, Junkers, Focke-Wulf, Heinkel, and the Horten brothers. The Horten brothers were known for having designed the Horten HO-229, which was the first jet-powered flying wing prior to their Amerikabomber submission. It was designed as a light bomber, but the aircraft was so fast, around 1,000 kilometers per hour, that the German Air Ministry insisted on adding 30mm cannons to the design as well, because they wanted to use it as a fighter as well as a bomber. And this is what it looked like under the skin. Here's the cockpit, here's the twin jet engines, here are the 30mm cannons. This whole center section was made from welded steel tubing, and the outer wing spars were made from pine. That's right, wood. The wings were covered with thin plywood that was covered with fire-resistant paint. The one surviving prototype of this aircraft is sitting in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, awaiting its turn for restoration. So this is a really cool and quite groundbreaking aircraft. But beyond just being cool, these flying wing designs are superior to conventional tube fuselage aircraft designs because the flying wings have superior lift to drag as well as lift to mass ratios. It should be said that the Americans weren't sitting on their hands while this Amerikabomber program was happening in Germany. The Americans had the exact same idea. The Americans knew that if England was overrun by Germany, they would lose their forward operating base and no longer be able to bomb Nazi facilities in mainland Europe. So you bet they were also working on a bomber that was capable of crossing the Atlantic and returning to America on one tank of fuel. The Americans eventually succeeded in creating this when the B-36 debuted in 1948. It was the first intercontinental bomber in human history, but it wasn't ready in time to participate in World War II. Turns out the Allies could manage without it in World War II, though, because England never fell to the Nazis, so B-17s and B-24s could get the job done just fine. As a very relevant side note to this subject, one of the designs competing for the position of the world's first intercontinental bomber was the Northrop XB-35, which, as you can see, was a flying wing design. It had all the advantages of flying wing designs that have already been mentioned, but it wasn't chosen as America's first intercontinental bomber because by this point in history, nuclear gravity bombs were the cornerstone of American national defense policy. And because the XB-35 was designed before anyone outside the American Manhattan Project knew about the existence of nuclear weapons, it was not designed to accommodate them. If you look at this cutaway drawing of the aircraft, you can see that the bomb bays are the spaces between the wing ribs. That's fine for a load of 1,000-pound bombs. But the first production thermonuclear bomb to enter service was 25 feet long and weighed more than 40,000 pounds. There was no way that was going to fit in those bomb bays. So because the B-36 could fit the first generation of nuclear bombs in its bomb bay, it was chosen to be produced, whereas the XB-35 was a lame duck from its inception. But as discussed, there is no aircraft form factor more efficient than a flying wing. That's why every large modern bomber since the late 80s has been designed and built in this form factor. But I'm speculating about an alternate history where Germany was able to build a bomber that could cross the Atlantic Ocean and return to Europe on one fuel tank in time for it to be strategically useful to the Germans. In order for this to happen, the aircraft would have had to have been designed in the 1930s so it could be operational in the early 1940s. This means jet power wasn't an option given the timeline. And even if it had been available, most people don't appreciate that the final generation of aircraft piston engines were more fuel efficient than the early generations of jet engines. So for a vehicle whose primary concern is range, piston engines and props are the better choice for a long-range aircraft at this time in history. So what would this aircraft look like? This is the B-29 Superfortress, the largest operational bomber of World War II. The B-36 I mentioned earlier, the first true intercontinental strategic bomber, was much, much larger. The B-36 was the largest operational combat aircraft ever created, the largest operational piston-engined aircraft ever created, the largest bomber ever created, and on and on. It was huge. Combat aircraft never got any bigger than the B-36 because the invention of aerial refueling made this escalating trend of aircraft gigantism unnecessary. But remember, we're designing a notional intercontinental bomber in the 1930s, when aerial refueling does not exist. So the aircraft is going to be a flying wing, and it's going to be huge. It's going to need a lot of power to get all that weight in the air. The B-36 needed 6 engines. I don't see why this would be any different. But you're going to need more ground clearance to help those enormous propellers not make contact with the ground on takeoff and landing. So we introduced some dihedral to the wings to elevate the props. Then we add some split-tip winglets to help with the aircraft's fuel efficiency. Finally, this aircraft is going to have to be able to defend itself because its range is so vastly far beyond the range of any fighter aircraft available at the time. And the aircraft is enormous, so there's all kinds of space and weight allowance for defensive armament. But the aircraft also has to spend 95% of its mission time flying over the Atlantic with no risk of enemy contact, and indeed is only at risk from American fighters for an hour or two at the very furthest reach of its mission. So those turrets retract, or are otherwise aerodynamically faired for the majority of the aircraft mission and don't deploy until they're needed when the aircraft is close to American shores. Except for these dorsal wing turrets. The wing isn't thick enough there for those turrets to retract. So this is what this aircraft would look like. What would a mission look like? It's late afternoon on December 11th, 1941. Hitler just announced his declaration of war on America a few hours ago. And Germany is planning to do the same thing that Japan just did: conduct a surprise attack on an unprepared and undefended America.
Bomb base 1 and 3 loaded. Bomb base 2 and 4 loaded.
Port and starboard and turrets. Close the tail fairing. Retract dorsal turrets. Fueling complete. Start engine number 3. All engines. Engaging all continental surfaces.
Park HO-5. You are cleared for taxi.
Copy. Taxiing to runway tower.
Copy. Park HO-5. Wind is 25 knots from 50 degrees. Runway clear.
Copy. Ready for takeoff tower.
Cleared for takeoff. Park HO-5.
Engaging max engine power. Prepare for takeoff. For the fatherland. Retract landing gear. Bearing 271 west. All gunner, I recommend you get some sleep. It will be a long night before we need you.
As the sun sets and the aircraft depart over the Atlantic Ocean, they settle in for a long overnight flight across the sea. In the pre-dawn hours, the aircraft disperse and head for their respective targets. Now, anyone that knows anything about the history of aerial bombardment in World War II knows that sending a single, unescorted aircraft on a bombing mission over enemy territory is basically a suicide mission. But remember, this is now December 12th, 1941. Pearl Harbor was only 5 days ago. Germany just declared war on America yesterday. It's months and years before America will turn into the mass production juggernaut that it was by the end of World War II. Right now, America's aircraft industry is trickling out aircraft at a snail's pace. There are no coastal defense batteries, and there are no early warning radar stations or combat air patrols. America's East Coast is completely undefended because America has been able to rely on a 3,000-mile wide moat called the Atlantic Ocean since 1776. But air power has changed all of that.
We are approaching fighter range. All gunners, man your turrets and deploy them. area. Come here, the ship is yours.
Copy that. Ship is mine. Open bomb bay doors. Closing in on target area. Target area in sight. Bombs away. Closing bomb bay doors. Payload released, Captain. Control is yours.
Returning to bearing 35 degrees east. Let's get back to the fatherland.
The Luftwaffe being able to bomb the American East Coast in World War II is a pretty scary scenario. But the truth is that even if the Nazis had had several dozen or a couple hundred of these intercontinental bombers, it wouldn't have been enough to stop the American military-industrial complex. America would have still drowned the Axis in an ocean of manufactured military hardware. The Allies spent years bombing Germany, sometimes with as many as 1,000 bombers in a single day, and it still took years to soften the country up enough for an invasion. Even a couple hundred Amerikabombers attacking the American East Coast wouldn't have been able to turn the tide of the war, especially considering that conducting a surprise attack on the East Coast like what's depicted in this video would have only worked once. America would have had fighters on standby starting the next day to prevent this from ever happening again. And there's no way the Amerikabombers could have ever had fighter escorts with them over the American coast, so the German bombers wouldn't have survived subsequent missions. That being said, there is one other scenario that might have changed all that. Most people don't know that nuclear fission was discovered in Berlin in 1938 by German scientists. If that discovery had been kept a secret, and Germany's nuclear weapons program had been given maximum resources like the American Manhattan Project, maybe Germany could have had dozens or hundreds of fission bombs by late 1941 or 42. And then a one-time surprise aerial attack might have looked very different than what we saw earlier in this video. If America's eastern population and manufacturing centers had been hit with several dozen A-bombs right at the start of the war, that very well might have changed the outcome of World War II. I think all of mankind can be glad that the Nazis weren't able to develop either intercontinental bombers or nuclear weapons.